Welcome to r/Reddit Revenge. This is a story of someone getting back at someone with revenge after being wronged. Thank you, friends, for subscribing to the channel and for so many likes. The first story. In a legal showdown, a young lawyer's ambitious autrefoire convict plea takes an unexpected turn, resulting in a clash with a rival attorney. Today's story is a lawyer's petty revenge on an ex-client and his new lawyer. How's it going? It was Kurt. I didn't like talking to Kurt, but I couldn't help it. We'd been classmates in law school. Kurt had finished near the bottom and I near the top, but Kurt was doing great and I was really struggling. I told Kurt I was doing okay. "What do you got today?" he asked. I had a bail hearing. I was starting to do more contested bail hearings because bail court was always packed, and it was a great place to pick up clients. You show up, fight for your client, and if you're lucky, you pick up another client, and on a good day, maybe even two. "Just a bail hearing," I said. "What about you?" "I have 5 guilty pleas," said Kurt, not trying to keep the delight out of his voice. "Wow, that's great, Kurt." Kurt was a dump truck. Back in the 90s, that's what we called lawyers like Kurt. Lawyers who knew no plea other than guilty. Kurt was going to plead 5 people guilty that day, and the legal aid plan was going to reward him handsomely for throwing his clients under the bus. He'd be leaving the courthouse a G-note richer in receivables. "I've opened 20 files this month," he continued. "Things are going really great. How about you?" "I'm doing okay," I said, and excused myself to do my crappy little bail hearing. I entered the courtroom and sat up front, waiting for things to get started, and while I waited, I wondered why Kurt had so many clients and I had so few. Kurt went to law school as a mature student, in his mid-30s when we started, but around 40 now. Maybe his maturity helped him. He had a hint of gray at the temples, but I had no gray at all. Instead, I had a decidedly baby-faced look about me. Maybe that was it, I thought to myself. Maybe I should grow a beard or something, make myself look a bit older. Then court started and I sat around waiting for my client's case to be called. We didn't have smartphones back in those days, so I sat there and watched as the judge started to run through his docket. There were a few consents, an adjournment or two, a comically brief contested bail hearing that ended with a set rep being set back to the cells in a rage, and then it was my client's turn. "I don't know this is contested," the prosecutor said. "We're willing to grant bail on conditions." I explained that my client didn't want conditions, other than to keep the peace and be of good behavior. The judge sighed and told the prosecutor to get on with it. So the prosecutor put the complainant on the stand. My client's ex-wife, and the court heard her tale of how my client had beaten her and tossed her down the porch steps at his house. When she finished, I got up to cross-examine. My client had told me a very different story about how his ex-wife went down the stairs, and some more things besides. "I believe you have a conviction for prostitution?" That's how I began. I've always liked getting straight to the point. "Yeah, but I got a pardon, so it don't count," the so-called victim said. That was a pretty good start. And it got better when the woman admitted, after a bit of rough handling to her chronic alcoholism, that she was excluded from all family events, that she knew she was unwelcome at her ex-husband's home, and the final kicker that after leaving said ex-husband's house, she'd been arrested for drunk driving, and it was only at the station after she blew 145 that the cop noticed bruising, and she told him all about what her evil ex-husband had done to her when she'd shown up for a family gathering. After I was done with her, I put my client's current wife on the stand, an eyewitness to everything including the so-called victim's drunken fall, and when she finished her testimony, the prosecutor leaned over to me and said that he'd be dropping the charges. A pretty good result for junior lawyer me, but not really because my client was factually innocent, and the prosecutor's witness was about as bad as you get. But still, I was feeling proud of myself. "Eat that, Kurt," I thought as I headed for the door. "Eat that, you dump truck." I left the courtroom and headed for the lawyer's lounge to brag about my success. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned and saw an old guy. "I need a lawyer," he said. He was maybe 50, which to me was pretty old. I recognized the man. He'd been in court for change of bail conditions on consent. He'd been hanging around waiting for paperwork when the court recessed. "I remember you. You're the guy charged with destroying a house." I didn't totally destroy it. That was true in the sense that the house was still standing, but he'd taken a chainsaw to it and other tools as well. And by the time the bank got him out of there, the place was a wreck. The man hadn't taken too kindly to being tossed out for not making the mortgage payments. I asked if he had any paperwork on him. He pulled out the original bail conditions, one of which was to keep his paperwork on him all times. I glanced at it. charged with damaging a mortgagee's interest in a property. Interesting. Heard of that one but never seen it. It's not fair, he said. I don't want to go to jail. I asked him what was his prior conviction. That's just it. I already went to jail for this house thing, 15 days I got. The judge gave me 15 days last month. What? The man said more words and then more, but his words were the scattered nonsense you hear from clients sometimes. The narrative out of order, the important facts buried under irrelevant nonsense, and in the end it took me almost 30 minutes to get the full story out of him at the coffee shop around the corner. But by the time he finished, I was excited. I was more than excited. I was seriously stoked. So let me get this straight, I said. The bank noticed you were wrecking the house with power tools when they came to check things out. Right. He was about to start talking again, but I held up my hand. And when they saw what you were doing, they got a court order telling you to stop wrecking the house. Right. And I held up my hand again. And after you got that court order, you wrecked the house even more, as in a lot more. I was pretty mad. Wouldn't you be if you were being kicked out of your own home? And when the bank saw that you breached that court order, they brought a motion for contempt. Yeah, and the judge, he gave me 15 days. And I served the whole 15, no parole or nothing. That seemed harsh, but when I looked into things a bit later, I learned that it was true, and that some prison officials thought that the usual parole rules didn't apply to those convicted of contempt. That's pretty harsh, I said. Do you think you can do something for me? We made an appointment for him to come to my office later that week, and after our appointment and receiving his retainer check, I started to dance around like a nut. I burst into Aaron's office. You'll never believe this, said. I got a new case. Yeah, said Aaron, the lawyer I rented space from. He was in his mid-40s, technically married but on his way to a divorce, and locked in perpetual mortal combat with his ex. Do I get a piece, he said. Aaron's family law lawyer was super expensive. I shook my head. Nope, I landed this client on my own, and you'll never guess how I'm gonna plead him. Guilty? Of course not. I hated pleading clients guilty. It was the last resort sort of thing. I was at court to keep people out of jail, not to help put them in. So, not guilty. Nope, I said. So you got your first insanity plea. Congratulations. Aaron found me amusing and maybe a little weird. I'd been lawyering for almost 3 years by this point, but I had lost none of the glee that I'd started out with. I still haven't after more than 30 years. Nope, you'll never guess. Guess what, said Dimitris, walking in to join us. He had been promoted to Aaron's partner a year before. A big mistake on Aaron's part. That promotion is what started them both on the path to disbarment. I got this new case and I'm gonna plead the guy autrefois convict. They stared at me blankly. I decided to educate them. Aside from the usual guilty or not guilty, there's 2 other pleas. Autrefois acquit and autrefois convict. You plead a guy autrefois convict if he's already been convicted of the thing he's charged with. When I learned about autrefois pleas in law school, I thought I'd never get a chance to do one. I'd never heard of anyone pleading it. It was just one of the zillion things I learned in law school that got shoved to the back of my brain as an interesting thing, but something I'd never need. After all, how often do people get charged twice for the same thing? That's it, said Aaron. That's why you're so excited? Because you're pleading this autrefois thing? Aaron didn't get it. Neither did Dimitris. When I got home that night, I told my wife all about it, and she didn't really get it either, not being a lawyer, but she understood me and was happy for me. Plus the $1,000 retainer. That made us both happy. The following month, my client's case came up, and I was ready. I was stoked. I checked the list and saw that I'd drawn Judge Herman, also known as the Herminator, but I didn't mind. The Herminator was a real hard A, but he respected good legal argument, and I had a good one that day. I walked into the lawyer's lounge and grabbed a cup of the SH coffee that was always on tap. In less than an hour, I was going to be in a courtroom. I was going to plead my client autrefois convict, and when I said those words, jaws would drop, pens would stop writing, mouths would stop moving, and all heads would turn at the strange plea, so rarely heard in a courtroom, and everyone would look at the lawyer who had entered the unusual plea, and they would say, who is this young lawyer? This new Robinette? This Greenspan? This Cicero? This... Hey, what do you have today? It was Kurt the dump truck. Kurt of the quick and dirty guilty pleas. Prosecutors loved Kurt. Judges loved Kurt. But defense lawyers hated him, and he was barely tolerated in the lawyer's lounge. A plea, I said, feeling smug. Just one? I've got 6. That's a record for me. I only had 5 coming in, but I picked up another. That's great, Kurt, just great. Kurt's crap couldn't touch me today. I was pleading a guy autrefois convict, and I didn't give a D how well Kurt was doing or how badly my practice was struggling. I was in legal heaven. But I didn't enjoy Kurt's company, So I left him and the crappy coffee in the lawyer's lounge and went out into the hallways to find my client. I found him sitting on a bench outside the courtroom. We had a brief discussion. "What do you mean you switched lawyers?" I said. "I talked to this guy," he said. "What guy?" He handed me a card, but before I looked at it, I knew what I would see. Kurt Mandrick. The card said barrister, solicitor, and dump truck. "But why?" I asked. "Why would you want to switch lawyers on the day of your court case? I know the case inside out. I'm totally prepared. We're going to plead you autrefois." "Yeah, but that outro whatever thing, Mr. Mandrick says he's never heard of it. That it's not really a plea. It's just going to make the judge mad." Dump truck Kurt had never heard of the plea of autrefois convict, and he'd infected the client with his ignorance. I tried to explain the autrefois convict plea again, but the client was locked in, and it's hard to shake a client who's locked in on some idiot notion. "Yeah, so Mr. Mandrick says he gets along great with the judges and stuff, and he told me I'd walk out of here with no jail time for sure." Wait here. I abandoned my client on the bench and headed back to the lawyer's lounge to have a short word with Kurt. When I opened the door to the lounge, there were a few of the older lawyers, the usual crowd. A couple of them were yakking away, another was making notes. Over in the corner was Kurt. I didn't want to embarrass Kurt or anything like that, and besides, even at that young age, I had already developed a wonderful sense of tact, of how to handle difficult situations politely and calmly. "What the F, Kurt?" I shouted. Pens stopped writing and mouths stopped moving and heads turned towards me. Kurt looked up at me appalled. "What the F?" I said again. "You stole my client, the guy who wrecked his house." The older lawyers looked over in disapproval. I turned to them and pointed at Kurt. "He stole my client right out in the hallway. I'm on the record. I got a retainer and all that, and this dump truck stole my client and now he's going to plead him guilty." "He wants to plead guilty," Kurt said. "Only because he's an idiot." I left the lawyer's lounge and headed back to where my client was waiting. I could hear the dump truck following me, and then Kurt and I fought it out in front of the client. An unseemly squabble. Embarrassing, really, especially considering that I lost. Lost to Kurt. Kurt of the guilty plea. Kurt the dump truck. I was forced to admit defeat. "Fine," I said, "but I'm gonna watch. Gonna get my money's worth." "What do you mean?" the client said. "I'm keeping your retainer. You're not getting a penny back." Our squabble became louder and more unseemly, and it ended only when the doors opened and it was time to enter the courtroom and watch the Herminator dispense justice. I sat there for an hour listening to adjournments and pleas, and then it was the turn of my former client and his new lawyer, Kurt. It was time for Kurt to work his magic. I watched as Kurt pleaded his man guilty without negotiating with the prosecutor, without preparation, without anything at all. "My client's a first offender," Kurt said, going on about his client's spotless reputation, about the client's moment of madness, his speedy regret, assurance that he would never do anything like that again. But this was Judge Herman's courtroom, and Herman liked to draw blood. He gave the client 30 days. The client jumped to his feet. "But the last time, the judge only gave me 15. It's not fair." "15 days for what?" said the judge. 15 days for wrecking a house." The judge turned to the prosecutor. "I thought you said no priors." The prosecutor shook his head. "Well," said the judge, "he's admitted to a prior, and I'm entitled to believe an admission against interest." He turned back to the poor sap standing in the dock before him. "I was going to give you 30, but seeing as you have a prior, and for the same thing." All Kurt could manage was a feeble but, and then he turned and looked at me as if for rescue. He mouthed something to me, and to this day I think he mouthed something like, "What was that plea?" But I ignored him, and I watched as the Herminator gave the client 60 days. The client began to speak, but it was the same style as he'd displayed in the coffee shop, a spew of meaningless words. The judge told him to shut up and sit down. When I walked out, Kurt was trying to get the judge to let his client serve his time on weekends, but the Herminator wasn't known for letting people serve time on weekends, and I didn't need to hear the rest. I went back to the lawyer's lounge and told everyone there the gory details, and we all had a good laugh at Kurt's expense. When I got home that night, my wife asked how did the case go. The case with that special plea. "It went great, really great," I said, and handed her a check for $1,000. And it was great actually, because that day the older lawyers in the lounge treated me like a peer. I felt their respect, and that made it all worthwhile. The prosecutor showed poor professionalism, recklessness, and negligence, as he should have been well acquainted with the history of the case and the facts that took place in it. The principles of autrefois acquit and autrefois convict are fundamental, and as a result the case should never have gone to trial. Kurt, who always tried to get his clients to agree to guilty verdicts, found himself in a terrible situation. But you, a young and energetic lawyer, thanks to your courage and belief in justice, took on a case that really impressed everyone around you. I have experience of observing the work of both highly qualified and less competent lawyers, and I always appreciate those who put their clients' interests first, rather than resorting to showmanship or trying to fill their own wallet. So continue to pave your own path in the world of law, where your courage and determination will always lead to something interesting and unexpected. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have a good day.